She had come in tears, but left as strong as ever, probably more so. Marie was amazed at how quickly the girl could sort and compartmentalize events. She was strong. Leah walked into ops wearing clean combats and a black t-shirt with a gun at her side. Dan was sitting at the table looking over a map with Jack as she entered, her emotional outburst seemingly forgotten. Dan nodded to Jack, who suddenly took his leave. "You okay, kid?" Dan asked the girl as she poured herself a coffee. "Fine now," she said, a little embarrassed about earlier. She sat down opposite him, waiting to be told she couldn't go out again. Quite why she was expecting it, she didn't know, but in truth, she wouldn't feel fear like that again if she were forced to stay put. "We'd have come off a lot worse without you today," he said, surprising her with praise instead of grounding her. "Mark would likely have died, and I doubt we would have got out without being attacked again if you weren't there. You did well. Thank you." She put her drink down and regarded him for a few seconds. She was happy with his praise, and had already dealt with the incident in her own mind. That she would have nightmares about dogs was as yet unknown to her. But to hear Dan saying that she had saved his life in a roundabout way was pleasing. She shot him a crooked smile. "Like I said," she told him, "next time if the dog sounds off, we walk away." "Agreed," said Dan, meaning it. Life in bloom. It wasn't long before Anna announced that she was pregnant. The news caused excitement amongst the group, and when the subject was raised in the council meeting, Kara gave her own admission with a red face. Both Chris and Matty were to be proud fathers. Kate gave a groan at finding her team responsible for midwifery, although she had been expecting it at some point. "Has anyone delivered a baby before?" she asked. "Loads," said Chris. "More than I can count," he admitted, prompting silence from the gathered heads of department who could not believe he had kept such skills from their knowledge. "I never said they were human babies," he trailed off lamely, receiving jeering comments at his poor humor. Epilogue. Kyle was dragged out of his kennel and walked into the building where they beat him, initially for information, then afterwards for entertainment. The leader told him to sit and stay. "Good dog. Do you know what we're doing tomorrow?" he asked in a voice oozing with threat. Kyle shook his head, looking at the floor. "Tomorrow, we're going to go and meet your old friends." Kyle tried not to cry. If he cried, they would hit him again. He thought of the others there. Lexi, Penny, the kids. He tried not to think about what they would do to them. He cried in silence, despite his fears. This is the end of Book 2, but the story continues with Society, After It Happened, Book 3. Keep listening after the credits for a free preview. You have been listening to After It Happened, Publisher's Pack, Books 1 and 2, produced by Greg Lawrence, Associate Producer Emily Durr. Text copyright 2017 by Devin C. Ford. Production copyright 2017 by Podium Publishing. All rights reserved.
This is Audible.
Podium Publishing presents After It Happened, Publisher's Pack, Books 3 and 4. Written by Devin C. Ford. Performed by R.C. Bray. Book 3. Society. Prologue. Maggie woke Cedric with a cup of black tea. She always woke before him, and their morning routine had begun to reintroduce itself. They were busy, and they were happy. The 12 others who had worked on the gardens would be coming soon, ready for a fresh day of working in the chilly sunshine. Cedric woke and smiled at her. pushing himself up in bed and squinting as he put his glasses on. She left him to get up in his own time and went downstairs to open the gates to their own walled utopia. She felt nothing was wrong as she walked past the rows of greenhouses. Matty drove through the gates shortly afterwards, towing a benched trailer full of people. They all greeted each other happily, and Maggie laid out the plan for the day. Cedric drank his tea and dressed, eager to join the others. He walked past the same greenhouses his wife had, without a care in the world. He slowed, his subconscious telling him something was different. He listened, and couldn't hear the normal sounds of the morning. He couldn't place it, but something wasn't right. A shout. Not a normal raised voice as people would do to be heard, but something in the tone that reached his ears made the panic start to rise in him. He stood still, debating whether to run to find his wife or go back and call for help. He didn't want to startle everyone by firing the fireworks alarm, but he felt something bad was happening. Slowly, he turned around and walked back towards the house. His walk turned into a run, his fear growing every second until his shaking hands reached for the big pump-action Remington hung on the dining room wall. He kept it loaded, so he just had to flick the safety catch off. He went back outside and heard more noises. A scream, another shout. He heard a single blast from a shotgun and ran to the garden. Inside the old lean-to garage, he kept a pallet of fireworks ready to go. He dragged it out, uncovered it, and lit the fuse. He didn't wait to see the bright rockets plume into the sky. Instead, he ran to the road and turned right to cross the fields and get to the gardens from the rear as the sounds of the rockets echoed and reverberated between the old walls. They were under attack. Hostile takeover. 3 of them were dropped off before the sun rose. "Make me proud, boys," growled Billy from the driver's seat of the car. They walked the short distance in and went along the wall until they crossed a field to climb fences and find a place to hide. They waited for almost 3 hours until one of the ambushers heard someone walking towards them from inside the grounds. There isn't supposed to be anyone here, he thought, fighting his panic. Failure was not something Billy liked. He forced himself to keep calm and stay hidden, waiting for the others to turn up. A woman came into sight and opened the gates. Good. They must be coming, he thought. A Land Rover drove in, towing a big trailer. People were sitting in the back on benches. Lots of people, including the woman. He counted 13 of them, but none of them had weapons he could see. They all gathered around the woman who was telling them what she wanted them to do. He flexed his shoulders and gripped the evil weapon in his hands, preparing for action. "Now!" he said loudly as he stepped out and leveled his sawn-off shotgun at them. The 2 others emerged similarly armed and took them all completely by surprise. "In the shed, all of you, now!" he said. They didn't move. He stepped forward and drove the savage short barrel of the gun into the belly of a fat lad with a scared round face. The lad doubled over, retching and struggling for breath. "Now!" he said again. They started to move. "Where's the fireworks?" he yelled at the woman. She seemed confused, making him shout it at her again. Silently, she pointed to a box by a door into what looked like an office. They filed into a large shed where the other 2 began to drag the creaking doors closed. The woman began to speak, so he fired a single shot in the air. The noise was huge, and she didn't finish what she had started to say. The doors closed, shutting them in the dark. Mission accomplished, he thought. Now to wait and launch the fireworks when the others were in position. He sat down, relaxing for now. He smiled, knowing that he had done his part well. He leaned back in cruel satisfaction, just as 24 fireworks began to scream into the sky from the other side of the distant greenhouses. Dead on. Dan was awake, but he didn't dare move. Marie was asleep with her back to him, her hips and lower back pressed against his body. His right arm was under her neck and couldn't be moved without waking her. His shoulder was locked. The pins and needles were creeping up his arm. He was happy. The rumor that she had been seen coming out of his room was a badly kept secret, and was one that he refused to confirm or deny. He heard the distant popping sound. It sounded like fireworks. Fireworks, he thought. He hadn't heard fireworks in ages. Fireworks, he said. His bliss was burst like a balloon, and as he flew from the bed, he almost tipped Marie onto the floor, inviting a string of swear words from her. She turned to see him throwing clothes on in a panic. Ash barked at him, also startled at the rude awakening. "What the fuck?" she snapped, dazed. "Fireworks. The alarm," he said, eyes wild with panic. He ran downstairs, shouting at the others to wake up. A crowd ran from the dining hall, their breakfast interrupted, and he repeated his shout. He burst into ops and threw open the armory, loading his carbine quickly and shoving the ugly brute of a shotgun in the holster on his back. Steve ran in next, followed by half a dozen others. Dan looked at the CB radio. Nothing. He daren't try and call them. "The Guardians," Dan shouted. Steve said nothing and began to arm himself. A few minutes later, his rangers were equipped and he faced the assembling crowd. "The fireworks alarm from the Guardian was set off," he said. "Nothing on the radio to say it was an accident," he continued, pointing at the CB. "I'll go over and see what's happening." He saw Leah and waved her towards him. "Fully armed," he muttered. "Get on the solar panel platform and cover the entrance." She nodded and walked away, no fear in her eyes, only a grim determination. "Neil," he yelled. "Here," came the call from over the heads of others. "Get the Thunderbird 2 and mount the GPMG out front." Neil nodded unquestioningly and left. "Steve, with me. Joe," he continued. "Boss," said Joe from behind him. "Clear the farm with Lexi. Stay on post until I call you back. Lex, take a battle rifle as well, and get up high." They understood, but nobody moved immediately. "Go," Dan barked, scattering them. Calm yourself, he thought. "What about me, boss?" asked Rich. Dan thought that now wasn't the time to hold back. "Kit up. Neil will be on the gun in front of the house and Leah will be on a solar tower. Place yourself in the trees to the left of the road where you can cover them both." Dan stopped, grabbed Rich's shoulder and spoke quietly. "Can you do this? If you aren't ready, you say so right now." "I'm ready," Rich replied, the flash of steel in his eyes reminding Dan that this man had seen war and did not want it to come to his home. "I'm ready," he said again with pure resolve. Dan believed him. "Chris," Dan shouted. He wasn't there. He was on the farm with Anna. "Ewan," he tried. "Here," came the little voice from somewhere around the knees of the crowd. "Everyone else who has been trained, give them a shotgun and some ammo." Pete hefted his rifle and shotgun. "Me and the lad will be down by the lake," he said, waiting for no confirmation. That was good. Very good. If whoever was intruding knew this place, they would know of the small access road leading to the rear. Please let this be an accident, Dan thought to himself as he strode outside, flanked by Ash and Steve. Hostage negotiation. Dan forced himself to drive steadily, his eyes scanning for an ambush. Steve had also brought a heavy military rifle and had his carbine on his back. He loaded a 20-round magazine, dropping an extra bullet into the chamber. "Drop me short. I'll loop and come in from the back," Steve said. "Okay, sit tight and do nothing until I do," Dan replied. He slowed down as they approached the junction, allowing Steve to slide out of the still-moving truck and sprint into the tree line. Steve would need maybe 3 or 4 minutes to get into position quietly, thought Dan as he rolled as slowly as he could to the entrance and turned in. Nobody there. Definitely not an accident. He got out of the car, leaving the driver's door open. "Down. Stay," he growled at Ash. He wanted Ash hidden for now. He walked slowly along, weapon ready but relaxed. He called Maggie and Cedric by name and only heard banging in response. They were shut in what they called the parting shed. He resisted the urge to open the doors yet, not wanting to fall for the classic come-on to put him in a kill zone. He waited. If his opposition were trained, they would either be flanking him or waiting for him to make a move. If they were untrained, they'd be waiting for him to do what they wanted or expected. He was sure he was being watched. His spine tingled with that familiar, inexplicable sense. He stood still and waited. He saw a twitch of movement from the shadows of an open-fronted storeroom. Undisciplined, moving position for comfort. He decided to play on their nerves. "Maggie, can you hear me?" he shouted, loud and clear. "Dan?" came the muffled reply, and the sound of shushing. "Yes." "How many?" he asked. "I saw 3 with sawn-off shotguns," she said, correctly anticipating the next question. The hidden man's nerve-racked patience failed him. He emerged from the storeroom and walked towards Dan, holding the shotgun at his waist. Dan looked at him, pulling a similar face to Ash's before he was let loose. "What's your plan, boy?" Dan asked him. "Shut up," he replied nervously. "Guns, on the ground." He was still about 20 meters away, way too far for the sawn-off to do any serious damage to him. "No thanks," Dan said, deliberately trying to unsettle him. "Let my people out and you and your 2 mates can go," he lied. The man laughed nervously. "You'll put your guns down and join them." Nothing like a bit of bravado to express how truly scared you really are, Dan thought. "I won't," Dan said. "You'll have to kill me, but you'll need to be a lot closer to do that. You ever shot anyone with one of those?" The man clutched at his gun with sweaty palms. He hadn't ever shot anyone with anything, and he was worried that this man in front of him had, probably lots of times. Dan saw a slight shadow of movement at the extreme distance of the gardens. Steve, he hoped. If it was, he was in the line of sight of Steve and his rifle. Dan turned and walked quickly to the building line before he sprinted around the back of the building and stopped behind the corner. The man watching Dan's arrival had 2 choices: follow him or don't. One of his mates had gone to see where the fireworks had come from and hadn't come back yet. The other one was hidden on the other side of the shed where they had shut the others away. He chose to follow him. He chose wrong and walked past the open door of the Discovery. Dan watched from the corner of the building as the man's shadow crept closer. He timed it right, releasing Ash. "Get him!" he yelled, hearing a snarl and a scream as he saw the shotgun fall to the floor. He ran forward to secure the weapon and stop Ash from killing the invader. 2 things happened simultaneously. The man who had gone to check the house and the source of the unplanned fireworks came back after hearing the raised voices to see Dan at the corner of the building. He crept up on this black-clad newcomer, and as he moved, the attacker raised the ugly gun to aim at the back of his head. He was about 5 meters away, close enough to decapitate Dan with a single twitch of his finger. The other man, hidden by the shed, ran forward to help his friend, who was being dragged around the door of the Land Rover like in a horror film. As he stepped out, Steve saw daylight behind his target. No longer fearing hitting someone friendly, he fired. The man aiming at Dan's head smiled, and as he heard the shot from Steve's rifle, he instinctively looked left, directly into the muzzle of Cedric's shotgun. The man froze. He had no idea what to do, and there was nobody there to make his decision for him. He raised the shotgun, meaning to scare the old man. The old man wasn't scared, and as soon as Cedric saw the man move, he pulled the trigger. The flame spreading from the end of the barrel was the last thing he ever saw, as his ragged and torn body was flung backwards to slam lifeless into a low wall. "Who's that?" Dan's voice called from around the corner, shaking Cedric from his entranced gaze at the dead man. "It's me, Cedric," he said as he rounded the corner, shotgun held low. He saw Dan dragging Ash off another man who looked very pale and in obvious agony. A great lump of flesh was missing from his forearm, exposing fat and muscle. It reminded him of pictures he had seen of shark attacks. "Maggie?" Cedric asked desperately. "Shed. Locked in," replied Dan as he got his dog under control. "Another one down further up. Come out carefully. Steve's down there with a rifle." Cedric held both hands in the air, still carrying the pump action. With less regard for his own safety than he normally would have, he moved into Steve's line of sight and rushed to open the doors. He stepped over the last man, now lying where he fell with his arms in a grotesque pose, like a string puppet cut loose to fall to the floor. All that was missing was the chalk outline. As the doors opened, Maggie threw herself into his arms. Dan shut Ash in the Discovery and returned to the man on the floor. He slung his own weapon and picked up the sawn-off. Opening the breech, he found both barrels loaded. The man was whimpering where he lay, curled up, legs thrashing with the pain he felt. No wonder, Dan thought. Ash had really taken a dislike to him. Blood loss was a concern, and he would probably never use that arm properly again. On the off chance he lived, that was. "Don't go anywhere, Treacle," Dan said with a worrying smile as he kicked the man onto his back. "I'm going to ask you some questions in a minute." Checkmate. Billy and his boys rode down the hill towards the house. They had seen the fireworks much sooner than he anticipated, and waited for the cavalry to rush out and leave the main prize unguarded. They didn't disappoint him. While the heroes were busy negotiating the release of their hostages, he would swoop in and take the house. Cruel, fast, simple, and bloody. "I want a lawyer." The man was hurting badly, gray with shock and blood loss, and shivering uncontrollably. Dan dragged him to the front bumper where he sat him hard up against it. Cedric had checked that everyone was unhurt and left them in Maggie's hands. She was straight on the radio to the house to let them know they were safe. Cedric came back over, still gripping the Remington. Dan looked at him, saw him shaking, and asked him if he was okay. "Yeah, fine," he said unconvincingly. Dan stepped closer to him. "Thanks. I owe you one. You did the right thing." Cedric cut him off. "It's not that," he said angrily, then took a breath and closed his eyes momentarily. "It's not that," he said more calmly, looking directly at Dan. "I thought I'd lost Maggie." He closed his eyes again, letting the adrenaline wash out of his body. "She's safe, thanks to you," Dan told him softly. Steve jogged up, having checked and disarmed his victim on the way up. Dan saw him and nodded to convey his thanks for the good shot. "Just 3?" Steve asked. "Looks like it." "Let's ask," Dan said with a wolfish look on his face. Dan turned to the pale man cringing against the front of his car. Dan threw his knife and cut a length of the man's top, making him flinch. He tied it tightly around his savaged arm as a tourniquet. "Don't want you passing out before you've told me everything you know, do we, Treacle?" he said, giving him a less than playful slap around the face. Dan stood. "Now, who are you, and why are you here, scaring my friends?" "Fuck you," the man said through gritted teeth. "Okay, try the hard man act." Dan bent down to his face and spoke quietly to him. "Let's get something clear. There's nobody going to drag me away if I get too rough. There's no solicitor arguing for you. There's nobody to complain to. There's just us. And chances are, if you don't tell me what I want to know, then you'll die slowly in a great deal of pain." He stood again, receiving an angry stare through teary eyes. "Are you going to answer my questions?" he asked calmly. "No. Comment," the man said, smiling through the excruciating pain as though he felt he had made a great joke. Very well, said Dan in a formal tone as he walked to open the door of the Discovery. I'll give you a choice. Talk to me or talk to my colleague. With that, he whistled once, and Ash bounded out of the car and stalked over to him. He circled around his owner's legs like a hunting wolf, never taking his eyes off the bleeding man. Watch him, Dan said, and Ash slowly stepped closer. Inches from the man's face, Ash gave him the full display of big, sharp teeth as he pulled his lips back and snarled. Watch him, Ash, Dan shouted again, making the dog snap at his face, and intensified the display with barking as he kicked it up a gear. Good boy. Turning back to the man, Dan said, Now, which one of us would you like to talk to? He decided to talk to Dan, who told Ash to sit. Billy gave us the orders. His dog told him everything about you, he said in between gasps of pain. From the beginning, said Dan patiently. Who is Billy, and how did his dog tell him about us? We found him around Christmas. Wanted us to come and kill someone for him, he said. Who? Dan asked impatiently, fearing the answer. You, he said, smiling through gritted teeth. Dan turned to Steve in horror as the truth dawned on him. Kyle. He's coming for the house, he said. He considered putting 2 bullets in the wounded man's head, but he would have to wait. Cedric, Dan bawled, running over to the rest of them. Radio the house and tell them this was a diversion. Lock this place down and give those sawn-offs out. He turned and ran to the Discovery. And tie this piece of shit up. Ash wants another word with him later, he yelled as he climbed behind the wheel. He reversed at speed, dumping the laughing man on his back painfully. Raiders. Pete heard them first. Get yourself up there, lad, he said to James, pointing to a higher patch of ground ahead to his left. Stay behind the big tree, and only come out shooting if I shout for you. James was white with terror, but fought to control his breathing and find his courage. He nodded and ran, carrying a shotgun and cartridge bag. Pete settled down on a large tree stump to look down the scope. He saw the 2 vehicles approaching and settled the crosshairs of his scope on the driver of the lead car. He agonized over whether he should shoot or not. Everything told him that these people were coming to take what they had built. Wait, he told himself. Wait. Neil had worked fast. With Rich helping, the GPMG was sitting ready and proud in front of the house in the bed of the truck. Nobody would risk driving straight up to it. That made him pause. If they wouldn't come here, they would go somewhere else. Somewhere undefended. He yelled inside for Ian. Jimmy poked his head out to say Ian wasn't there. Can you grab the keys to one of the lorries? Neil shouted back. He told him what he wanted, and Jimmy didn't hesitate. Leah lay flat in sniper pose, right leg cocked at an angle to allow her diaphragm to move without affecting her shot. She had taken a G-36, which she had fitted with a bipod and scope for distance shooting. Nobody else used the guns, so they were effectively hers. She lined 3 magazines up by her left hand and felt for them as she looked through the optic, ready to reload without looking at what she was doing. 90 rounds ready to go, and she would make them count. She scanned the scope up and down the driveway, waiting as Neil called up to her to stay hidden until he fired first. She yelled that she understood. Rich knelt behind a large oak tree. He was scared, terrified in fact, but the carbine felt good in his hands. He looked through the holographic sight, checking the approach road. He was to the left of the house, closest to the ones who had gone to cover the rear access track, a fact he was acutely aware of when a single gunshot echoed through the trees from where they were. They had put all their best guns up front, leaving 2 civilians with hunting weapons to defend the rear. Pete waited for the car to reach the narrowest part of the track with mud either side before he fired, putting a bullet in the driver's head. The car stopped, causing a pile-up behind, as the others couldn't get past. The driver of the rear car tried the mud to the side and got bogged down, as Pete hoped he would. Pete racked the bolt slowly on his rifle, lined up again, and shot the second driver in the neck, seeing him flinch and grab at the wound, which now sprayed blood over the inside of the windscreen. They realized that their element of surprise was lost, and they started to get out. They pointed in his direction and began to fan out. Pete slid the bolt with a smooth, practiced action to load another bullet into the chamber and vowed to take as many of these bastards as he could before they got him. Lexi was flat on top of a metal grain silo on the farm. Joe was below her somewhere, eyes on the road. She saw the 3 cars drive into sight. They didn't come to the farm, but sped down the hill to the main house. She didn't have time to get a shot off and had to make a choice. "Joe," she shouted. "I'm here. What do you see?" "3 cars heading fast for the house. I'll stay here. You move up to cut off the drive. Don't go inside of the house as you'll get shot by ours." "Moving," was the only reply she heard. When Rich heard the second shot, he knew he had to do something. He shouted for Neil's attention, but the older man couldn't hear him. "Nicky!" Rich shouted, using the abbreviated Nikita nickname as he usually did. He saw her scope swing towards him. He gave her 3 exaggerated hand movements, pointing to himself, then to the woods behind him, then a change of hand movement. He was telling her he was moving to flank the rear attack. Leah understood. She gave one flash on the torch attached to her weapon in acknowledgement. "Go," she said to herself. "Go get them." The 3 cars raced along the drive, 400 meters from the house. At 300 meters, Jimmy did what Neil had asked him to. He drove the lorry forward and left around the ornate turning circle, exposing Neil with his legs braced wide and his hands on the machine gun. Pete fired a whole magazine, killing 3 for the 5 bullets. He only had 1 magazine for the gun, so he had to load single rounds into the breech. It was quicker than trying to reload the mag. They were getting closer. He wasn't going to take them all down before they got to him. Twice more he fired, missing with 1 shot. He thought of his girls, and a tear pricked the corner of one eye. "Bastards," he growled. "Bastards." He lined up on another, this time close enough to see the features of the target's face. He fell before Pete fired, his legs dropping like someone had switched his power off. They had. The twin reports of a double tap from a gun with a different sound reached Pete's ears, and he knew that he had been saved. Rich ran a long, bursting sprint through the ancient woodland, thick with gnarled tree roots. He had almost a quarter of a mile to cover on bad ground. In his day, he would have covered that in less than 3 minutes. He ran, slipping twice and scrabbling to his feet to continue as he counted more shots from ahead and to his right. He was blowing hard, but he knew there had to be more in the tank. He paused, finding where Pete had stopped the vehicles by killing 2 drivers. The cars were abandoned, the occupants gone forward on foot. The foliage was too thick to see into the distance, but the steady rhythm of gunshots still came, and now it was mixed with the staccato sound of return fire from something smaller firing automatic bursts. He turned to his left again and ran as hard as he could for 200 meters to gain the high ground. He steadied his breath, checked his weapon, and crept down towards the road, scanning. Movement ahead. He raised the gun in a fluid motion and instinctively fired twice into the middle of the body in front of him. He moved forward, willing himself to go on despite his fear. Movement to his right. 2 of them. He dropped 1 knee and aimed, firing twice more into each shape. He forced himself to his feet to keep moving. He was lost in himself, a machine designed to kill the enemy quicker than they could kill him. His weapon drills were slick and spoke of long hours of practice he'd feared he had forgotten. He was alive. He was angry. And they would be sorry. "Now!" Neil screamed. Jimmy gunned the engine of the small lorry, making it jolt forward to unveil the heavy machine gun mounted in the bed of the truck. Neil opened up on the lead vehicle, heavy bullets punching through metal and plastic easily. At that distance, it was butchery. The front vehicle swerved off the road into a fence where it stopped dead against a tree, exposing the second car in line to the murderous fire. Leah took careful aim on the windscreen of the tail-end vehicle. As soon as Neil began to fire, she put 4 rounds in quick succession straight where the driver's center mass would be. The car lost control and slammed into the rear of the second vehicle, which had ground to a halt. Leah scanned along the wreckage, searching for a target. A rear door opened on the last car on the side away from her, and a tentative head popped into view and looked forward to where it thought the danger was. "Over here," she whispered to herself, like in the film she shouldn't have watched about the alien who killed all the soldiers in the jungle. She fired, immediately searching for a new target. Neil fired only occasional bursts now, while she scanned for movement. They were hiding in the dead ground on the other side of the vehicles. Rich would have been there, but he had gone to ambush the ones attacking Pete. She waited for a break in the firing and bawled Neil's name as loudly as she could. "What?" he shouted back. "Fire under 2, she shouted. They had to be forced from cover before they had a chance to reorganize and fire back. "What?" he yelled again. "Fire under the second car," she screamed, carefully pronouncing each word. They heard her and started to move. Neil sent 3 bursts under the car, splaying 2 of the attackers out on the ground and making another 2 run for the nearest cover of the tree line. She lined up on the first one, judged his speed, and fired just in front of him. She fired a second and third bullet into him as he hit the ground. The other was gone. Joe had thrown himself into the bushes to cut the corner between the farm and the road. He now lay flat, catching his breath. He heard the undergrowth being trampled, and the sound was fast approaching him. He knelt up, rifle scanning the bushes ahead. Too big to be a dog, not even Ash, and no farm animals were anywhere near this woodland. The noise was coming fast, desperate sounds escaping the runner as they blindly fled the heavy firing coming from the house. Then movement to his right. He turned instinctively and fired a short burst. He was rewarded with the thump of a person hitting the ground. Dan nearly had his heavy vehicle on 2 wheels as he drove as hard as he could. He tore down the driveway with Steve bouncing off the window as he swapped his rifle for the carbine. He slowed to a stop when he saw a wrecked convoy spoiling the views of their home. He got out, and he and Steve went along each side of the vehicles in tandem. 6 dead. He ran the last 300 meters to the house, forgetting about his Land Rover and the dog guarding it. Neil met him there, shouting for Rich, who was nowhere to be found. Leah had climbed down from her perch and was running over. "He heard Pete open up and ran back through the woods to help," she shouted over them. Neil and Dan glanced at each other. Dan suddenly realized he needed his car and his dog and turned to see Steve driving it towards him, pressed up to the driver's window to be as far away from Ash as he could get. As Steve pulled up, Dan saw Ash was smiling at him to show off his teeth. Dan wasn't in the mood for a possessive dog and shouted at him to leave Steve be. He threw himself behind the wheel, and Leah jumped in the back with a reproved Ash. He drove as fast as he could again, cutting out the road and using the grass as the direct route to the track behind their home. He stopped behind a large tree stump, which had been Pete's chosen firing position. Pete had been hit. Dan yelled at Steve to deal with him, pointing Leah to the high ground on his left as he stalked forward with his weapon up and his dog at his heel. A low, short whistle sounded to his right. He turned to see Rich, covered in leaf mold and with mud on his face, kneeling in the bushes with his gun up and scanning. Dan crouched by his side. "Report," he said in a low voice. "Vehicle ambush. Driver killed. Second vehicle tried to go round. Driver also killed. Rest went on foot. I hit them from the bushes to the side. Took out 4. All dead. Pete killed 4, including the drivers," Rich said bluntly, giving each succinct sentence like it was a bullet point. It sounded professional. "Any outstanding?" Dan asked. "Unsure. Vehicle's empty when I saw," he said back, still sweeping the rifle side to side. With me then. Friendlies to the rear and left flank, and don't shoot my fucking dog. Rich smiled out of the corner of his mouth. It was a grim smile, but it told Dan that the Marine was still connected to the real world, no matter how unreal it had just become. The three of them stalked forward. Dan and Ash moved, then covered Rich as he leapfrogged. The scene of the ambush Rich pulled on them was gruesome. 4 bodies lay quite close to each other, all with neatly grouped pairs of bullet holes in their chests. Dan reckoned that Rich must have fallen on these unsuspecting bastards like a fury. They got to the vehicles and found nobody alive. "Find 'em," he said to Ash, pointing him ahead. If any stragglers had got away, they wouldn't be going far. Ash put his nose to the ground and sniffed around, twice being sent ahead to cast for a scent. Nothing. They turned and jogged back to Pete's position as Dan called out to Leah not to shoot them. She brought James back with her. He was dazed, but it seemed that something had snapped inside him when he heard Pete cry out. He poured shotgun rounds towards the sounds of enemy gunfire as fast as he could, making them pause. Rich descended on them immediately afterwards after they closed up to discuss what to do. Pete didn't seem badly hurt, but he had a pair of bullets in the fleshy part of his shoulder where it met the upper arm. Leah pulled a clotting field dressing from her vest and replaced the slightly less effective hand of Steve's. She wound it tight, telling Pete to keep pressing on it. "Get him in the truck. I'll take him to Kate," Dan said. He wanted to leave a guard down there and didn't want it to be the terribly damaged Royal Marine or his teenage protege. "Steve, can you hold down here for a while?" he asked. Steve retrieved his big rifle and nodded. Pete was lifted into the back seat, relegating the dog to the boot, much to his annoyance. "I'll bleed on your seat, lad. I can walk," Pete moaned, typically as one of the don't-want-to-cause-a-fuss generation. "It's leather. It'll wipe clean," Dan replied. He looked behind him in the mirror as he drove the short distance. He saw an old alcoholic poacher having gunshot wounds treated by a heavily armed teenage girl as a concerned dog with a blood-soaked muzzle licked Pete's sweating head and whimpered in sympathy. Pete was receiving so much attention he could barely open one of his hip flasks. Dan glanced to his side, where Rich had opened the passenger window to rest his rifle out. Rich was half-turned, as if expecting a contact at any moment. "Rich," Dan said, "tell me where you are." Without taking his eyes off the landscape, he replied, "Not Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Belfast, but right now just as bloody dangerous." "I'm good, boss, seriously." He knew exactly what Dan meant. They pulled up at the front of the house, and Dan yelled for Kate. Pete was making a huge racket, telling everyone he was fine and that he could walk. He tried, but ended up more carried upright than walking. He took his dignity intact into medical, although that dignity was still holding a hip flask as though his life depended on it. As Kate walked out, Leah gave her a casualty-style history just as she had taught her. "Male, 60s, GSW ×2, upper right arm and shoulder, no exit wound. Field dressing with coagulant applied less than 5 ago." Kate thanked her, as though receiving a verbal trauma report from a teenager with a machine gun was perfectly normal. "I'm 58, you little shit," yelled Pete, half in jest, as he was led away inside. What the hell just happened? Dan called everyone together. He told Jimmy and Neil what he wanted and left them to it. He warned them to be careful, as Steve, Lexi, and Joe were still deployed. He told Leah she was with him, and asked Rich to get on the radio and tell the Gardens he was on his way back and that they had repelled an attack on the house. "Tell them I'm coming to talk to Ash's chew toy," he added nastily. Rich knew he was being benched now that the state of emergency was over, and he took it gracefully. He felt proud of himself. He felt useful for the first time since his life was changed by a crude roadside firebomb. Marie burst from the main doors carrying a shotgun and demanding to know what was going on. Dan tried the not now tactic and nearly lost his head as she bit it off. "Tell me what happened," she said, somewhat close to his face and showing a dangerous look in her eyes, a mixture of fear and rage. The Gardens were attacked by 3 people with sawn-offs. Steve killed one, Cedric another, and Ash ripped the last one half to pieces. He's still alive for now, but I will be having a chat with him very soon." She absorbed this quickly, knowing that she would get the full details from everyone in turn. "And," she said, "and it was a diversion. They were coming here, which they did in 2 convoys, front and rear. Pete stopped the rear convoy, but took a couple in the shoulder. James fired at them enough to confuse them into bunching up, then Rich hit them from the side. You can see what happened there," he said, indicating the smoking ruins of 3 Swiss cheese-like vehicles in the near distance behind him. There was so much to take in that she said nothing for now. She simply raised herself on her tiptoes and kissed him gently. She handed him the shotgun like it was making her hands dirty, and told him to come back safe. He turned away and tossed the shotgun to Rich before getting back behind the wheel and driving up the road, only to stop by the driveway entrance where Joe was dragging a body from the trees. Dan stopped and looked at the man. He was filthy, with long hair and a matted beard. He stank. He looked such a mess that Joe had to point out that it was Kyle. Dan stared in silence for a while at the emaciated body of the man who had tried to kill him once. "Well done, Joe," he said. "Take him down to the others. We'll be back soon." They reached the Gardens, and Dan asked where the prisoner was. He was not doing well, but he didn't have to last long for what Dan wanted. "Oi, fuckface. Remember me?" Dan said as he slapped the prisoner back into consciousness, looking at the butcher's mess of his arm and noticing that 2 fingers were badly dislocated and splayed out at grotesque angles. If Leah was affected by the sight of a badly wounded man being mistreated, she showed no sign of it. Dan doubted if she knew about either the Geneva Convention or the Human Rights Act. Pain racked his face as the consciousness brought back the feeling of the mangled flesh that used to be his forearm. Of course you do. Now, I've got a job for you. If you do it properly, I'll get you medical care. If you don't, I'll feed you to my dog." Dan snapped his fingers in front of the guy's face as he was drifting away again. He nodded. Dan liked to keep the rules simple. He had his hands tied together at the front and bandaging around the jagged wounds. Leah put her rifle in the front seat out of his reach and sat behind Dan as their prisoner was dumped in where Dan could see him in the mirror behind the passenger seat. Ash rode up front, watching. It was less than a minute before the desperate fool made his move. Instead of opening the door and rolling out for a bid for freedom, which would have resulted in Dan gently stopping and allowing Ash to exit via the window, he went for Leah's knife on her left shoulder. He was quick, turning and reaching out with his left hand, but as quick as the flurry of movement started, it was ended. Dan looked back to see Leah's left boot pressing into the guy's throat and holding him painfully against the window. She had drawn her sidearm as fast as a lightning strike and held it pointed at his face as she braced her shoulders against her door and arched her back to increase the pressure. He froze, experiencing yet more agony. She had it covered. "Nicely done, Nikita. I think our friend can travel the rest of the way like that," Dan said nonchalantly. "Roger," came the reply, in a funny voice copied from a film he couldn't remember. Simple investigation. The bodies of the attackers had all been laid out on the drive next to the smoking ruins of the convoy. 8 of them had been brought up by tractor from the rear attack and laid next to the 10 from the 3 vehicles. Kyle was one of them, marked out as different by his filthy clothing and obvious malnutrition. Leah released her new best friend's throat, recoiling like a mongoose as she slipped from the vehicle while keeping the foresight of her Glock firmly between his eyes. Dan dragged him out and marched him to the line of bodies. "Which one's Billy?" Dan demanded. The shade of pale purple the man had turned during the journey was fading, and he had just about recovered sufficient breath to speak. "Him," he said, indicating a normal-looking man with bullet holes either side of his skull. That was me, Leah said aloud, trying not to sound too proud. Dan glanced casually from the ambush site to the tower she had been perched on during the attack. Bloody good shot, he thought to himself as he fought the urge to offer a high five. Excellent answer, he said with a false smile. You progressed to round 2. Are these all of your friends, apart from the 2 dead bastards we left where you pointed guns at innocent people? He started to cry, a pathetic keening noise which cut through Dan's brain painfully. They were. His entire gang, Billy's crew, all wiped out, he was sure. No matter how much this psychopath threatened him with his child assassin and his evil dog, no matter how much pain he was in, he was the only one left. Okay, you can go, Dan said, looking around. Dan saw only Rangers, Jimmy and Neil, and knew that they were shielded from the house by trees. Really? He asked, the revelation stopping his tears instantly. Yes. How far is your place? I'll drop you off, Dan said reasonably. Dumbstruck, the man's mouth opened and closed a few times as he processed what he had just heard. You know the athletics stadium? Just off the motorway? He asked, naive and hopeful. Yes, said Dan, drawing the suppressed Walther from his vest and putting one round behind the man's ear at point-blank range. Nobody spoke as the man's body slumped to the floor with his friends. His legs gave out just like someone had switched off the power supply. A few seconds of silence reigned as they all stared at the additional body on the ground. Well, that was frightfully silly of him, declared Neil in his favorite accent, breaking the silence. Who would pick a fight with a group of armed gentlemen and expect to get away? They laughed at Neil's impression as they all accepted their agreed account of how the man died. Silly chap. Still, couldn't be helped, eh? Who wants a cup of tea? Clean up. The bodies were stripped of anything useful, as were the cars. It had been months since they had burned dead people in the tennis court, but they used petrol to light another fire as they had before. The difference being that they made these people dead intentionally. Ewan spent the afternoon in his vehicle and extra weaponry. Everyone was brought in for the day to get to grips with what had just happened. Marie gave the facts to the assembled group. Now that they numbered over 70, she had to stand at the pulpit in the chapel, or diverse multiple faith room as the sign read, to be heard easily. She gave the brief facts, left out the gory details, and told everyone what was being done about it. Some of you will remember Kyle, and the others will have heard about him, I'm sure, she said. It seems that after he fled from here, a group of undesirable people found him and imprisoned him. He must have given them in-depth details about our home, which allowed them to attack us. Murmurs rippled around the crowd. Their attack was repelled. She spoke loudly and confidently. Their group is no longer a threat to us. Everyone who knew about this is dead. She let that sink in. Thanks to the quick thinking and bravery of Cedric, Pete, James, Neil, and our Rangers, we are still whole. She looked at each person she named as she spoke. Rangers were expected to fight. It's what they chose to do. When farmers and gardeners and mechanics put their lives on the line, then that needs recognizing to reassure them. The murmur picked up a notch. Now it's true, Pete has been shot in the attack as he and James defended us. The murmur dropped in happiness level. But expert medical care from Leah at the scene, and then Kate, Lizzie, and Alice has saved him. He is now resting in medical and needs time to heal, but I'm sure all of your thoughts are with him. Again, she looked at those as she named them, amazing Dan at how she knew where they were in the crowd. The murmur swayed from concerned to proud, and now returned to happy. I know this has been difficult and frightening, but until order is established on a wider scale, then we must do as we have done to protect innocent people. She paused, orchestrating the mood of the crowd like a maestro. We have all been through bad things since it happened. and more bad things may be in store yet. But today we have proven that we are stronger as a group than these people thought. That's why we're here and they're not." The excitement rose again as Marie went on with her effective propaganda. Dan didn't know how she managed the strings so well, but she actually got a cheer at the end of the speech. Dan wanted nothing more than to take the day off, to get back in bed with Marie, to have had breakfast instead of skipping straight to dinner. However, he had a dog covered in blood, a damaged Marine in need of a serious checkup, a 13-year-old who had just killed 3 people and seemed to think nothing of it, and a friend in the hospital with 2 big holes where Kate had pulled bullets out of him. He had Cedric to manage, who had killed someone with a shotgun as he aimed at Dan's own head, something that hadn't even sunk into his own mind yet. He also had over a dozen people frightened being held hostage, a shortage of ammunition for the machine gun, and an enemy lair to find and destroy. "Grant me the serenity," Dan said aloud to himself as he walked through the house. He decided to start with the things he could fix easily. That way his to-do list seemed to make progress. First stop, Pete. Dan found him happily propped up on a hospital bed with a large clean bandage over his shoulder and his arm in a sling. Kate showed Dan the small bullet she had removed and told him that she had had to give Pete a little sauce to aid his recovery. Dan understood and asked for a quiet report on how much he was having to keep functioning. Pete accepted the thanks blithely, playing down the evident sacrifice he would have most likely made had James not done what he did and Rich not chosen to come to their rescue. Dan provided Kate with a bottle of scotch to help her keep Pete happy and save on the medication. He fetched Ash and headed for Ops, looking for Leah or Rich or both. He found both. All the weapons that had been used that day were stripped fully and put back together, oiled. The big machine gun had suffered a jam on the last burst, and Neil had been unable to clear it. The gun now lay in pieces, the delicate components laid out in OCD straight lines on a clean cloth. Leah and Rich sat at the table looking over the new weapons picked up from their attackers. They were arguing kind-heartedly over which gun had injured Pete. Rich was adamant that it was the ancient and very illegal Uzi automatic pistol with filed-off serial numbers. That thing had probably changed hands numerous times over the last 30 years as it made its rounds through the criminal underworld, being held sideways and pointed out of car windows. Right caliber, 2 wounds close together, high rate of fire. It was this, Rich said, resting his finger on the dull and uncared-for weapon. "Okay, maybe you're right," Leah admitted. "You 2 gun geeks have any other hobbies?" Dan asked them. "No, not really," Leah said, deadly serious. Dan sighed. He knew she would never have the end of her childhood as she deserved, but the fact that she seemed to enjoy it so much concerned him sometimes. "Fine. I've got a search and rescue mission for you instead. Solo. Can you do it?" he asked seriously. "Yes. Details?" she said, jumping up. "Ops. Missing bottle of single malt. Not been seen for 2 days. Should be in company with a glass. Go." Leah knew when she'd been played and walked off to fetch what she was sent for. Dan opened one of the large windows and sat on the floor with his head resting on the sill. He lit a cigarette and answered the dog's grumbling with, "Shut it, tobacco Nazi." Ash put his head down with a grumble and didn't press the issue. Leah returned with the bottle and glass, taking her leave before she was sent. Dan had already primed Marie to intercept her. "Do your teeth before bed," he called after her. "Yes, Dad," came the sarcastic reply. Some dad, he thought. Both Leah and Rich knew what the shakedown was for, and she knew she would be sent away so Dan could do his after-action report. He poured himself a measure and suddenly realized how thoughtless he was being. He started to apologize to Rich, who stopped him. "It's fine. I can choose to drink or not. Today isn't really a celebration day for me, so I won't be having one, but thanks." Dan raised his glass to him anyway and took a sip. "I wanted to ask you something," Dan started. "I'm fine. I went into a bit of autopilot and I was scared. Really scared, actually. Rich said, fiddling with the extended magazine from the Uzi. I was actually going to ask what made you leave the post you were given, Dan said quietly. Rich stopped fiddling and looked at him coldly. That came out wrong, Dan said, backtracking. What I meant was, how did you know to reinforce the rear? Rich calmed down immediately, having momentarily thought he had been accused of desertion because Dan had not been careful with his words. 2 civvies out back, 3 trained out front. Judgment call, he said, almost grudgingly. Dan took a sip of his drink. You did bloody well. You saved lives, possibly all of ours. I need you to understand that this isn't the military. There's no chain of command with orders to obey, not really. I don't have the monopoly on good ideas, and I appreciate having people around me who can think independently. What matters to me is that you got the job done. You saw a leak and you plugged it. Not only that, you dropped 4 people who looked like they hadn't even seen you. They hadn't, Rich said, smiling wickedly out of the scarred corner of his mouth. Dan raised the glass to him again. What about our resident child assassin? Did you hear what she did in the back of my truck? He hadn't. Dan filled him in on the details. Rich laughed heartily as he imagined Leah going full ninja, as he put it. I honestly don't know what to make of her sometimes, Rich said. She doesn't show any signs I'd recognize as anything being wrong. Maybe she's just adapted to it. Dan took another drink, draining the glass. Maybe, he answered. I just sometimes wish she'd refuse to get out of bed or something. You know, be a normal teenager. You can't expect her to be normal, explained Rich. We don't live in a normal world anymore. True, said Dan. Anyway, I'm officially bloody impressed with your work. Are you looking to get out and about? He was offering him a shot at being a ranger, and Rich surprised him. Not yet, no, Rich said. I've honestly spent enough of my life creeping along waiting to get shot at. I'd like to stay as quartermaster and look at the defenses for this place if I can. Dan was happy with that. What about special occasions? Can we dust you off for the odd one? He laughed. Dawn Raid, guest starring me? Yeah, said Dan. Rich nodded his agreement and offered him his congratulations on a successful day. Dan shook his maimed hand as he left. Dan looked for Leah and found her walking with Marie to her office, each carrying a hot chocolate from a large batch made up by Nina. Dan went back to Ops and poured himself another drink as Ash whined nervously at Satan's reincarnation. The cat had been dislodged from its normal perch as Rich had sorted out the ammunition properly, so it now chose to lounge on a shelf with its legs hanging down. It avoided the shopping basket bed and preferred the height advantage from which to tease the dogs. Steve sat reading a book with his feet up by the window, which looked along the drive. The CB set to his right was silent, and the coffee to his left looked cold. The pilot looked up from his book long enough to give a friendly nod. Dan liked that about Steve. He could do comfortable silences. Dan wanted out to find Cedric and thank him for saving his life. He also planned to ask him if he would kindly not mention to Marie how close he had been to getting his head blown off. The lair. Dan did not entirely trust Ash's friend that the whole group had come in force to take over their home. He planned to make sure. Leah and Rich were left as guard, and he took the 3 rangers to work in pairs. They went in 2 vehicles, Dan in his Discovery with Joe and Ash, and Steve behind in his Defender with Lexi. He knew the stadium, as it was the only one within a 50-mile radius at least. The main reason they had never come across this group was that there were no real main roads that connected their areas, and to find them would have made for an illogical and ponderous journey. If one of them had panicked and fled blindly across country for over 10 miles, they might have found the place eventually. As they approached, they saw a supermarket on the opposite side of the road. That was why they weren't struggling for supplies or having to go out anywhere. Kyle dropping in must have been something of a surprise for them. Across the front of the supermarket were the painted words, "Claimed, looters will be killed." Friendly people. They had stopped the cars short of the building and made the last half mile on foot, working in 2 pairs, covering and moving in silence. They found the place abandoned, with evidence of where the occupants had slept and a cache of bags ready to be collected after they had established themselves in their new home. It had been well planned, but by amateurs. They deserved their fate. They had made no attempt to plan for the future, either through inability or a lack of imagination. Did they really expect to survive forever like this? Lexi emptied all the bags, looking for anything useful, and found nothing. They had put all their eggs in one basket, and had had it knocked from their hands as they deserved. Dan cleared the upper level with Ash, as the others did the same downstairs. Nobody home. Either there were others, and they had fled after the rest didn't come home, or Dan had extracted the truth before he shot the only survivor in the head. They returned to the vehicles and poured coffee, deciding what to do with the rest of the day. Steve laid out a roadmap on the bonnet of the Discovery, as Dan wondered aloud if there were any groups of survivors left who weren't arseholes. Lexi knew the towns of a nearby county, having grown up there. Steve, not being from the area originally, went with Joe in his own Defender towards the countryside in the direction they were pointing. Lexi went with Dan and Ash, as that way both crews had a sniper option if needed. They wished each other luck and planned to be back home by nightfall. Dan called up home on the CB and got Rich straight away. "Go ahead, boss," Rich said. "Nothing here. Intel must have been good. Splitting into 2 teams for recce further afield. Back by nightfall," Dan replied. "Roger. Happy hunting and stay safe." Rich came back. The weather was blowing cold and wet as Dan drove along endless 50-mile-an-hour roads, thinking that the commute along here would have been dull. They reached a small town that didn't even have a full supermarket, and saw that the windows had been broken long ago, probably before the winter. They pressed on, going from small town to village as they went. Each settlement showed aged signs of having been systematically emptied of supplies. They were probably 2 hours from home when Lexi pointed out a vehicle that didn't look right. Dan rolled to a stop and killed the engine. They watched from a distance, waiting for anyone to return to the small truck, which was obviously still in use. No vehicle which had been left idle for over half a year would be in such good condition. Everywhere, the cars were covered in old dead leaves and a green film of neglect. But this one had fresh windscreen wiper marks, showing clear glass. "Play it nice or play it careful?" he asked the car out loud. Ash stopped panting to give a small grumble and nuzzle his face. Lexi suggested that they play it nice. Dan started the car and drove slowly forwards. As they neared the car, he stopped and went to get out. Lexi followed suit. "No," he said, "wait here. If they aren't friendly, then let Ash out and you follow." She nodded and let go of her door handle. Dan slipped out, walking slowly and keeping the barrel of his gun pointing towards the floor. He got his familiar feeling of being watched and hoped it wasn't through the sights of anything which went bang. He stopped by the car, looking around. "Hello?" he called out, and waited. He looked around, fighting the urge to raise the weapon and use the scope for better detail. He knew Lexi would be itching to get out, but they had to give off the vibe of being friendly. "Hello?" he tried again, louder. A noise behind him made him turn to see a man dressed in camouflage clothing in a doorway. He held a large rifle, the same size as their own battle rifles, but this one was older, with a wooden stock. "Hello?" he said back, keeping his own gun pointed at the floor. Dan took his hands away from his weapon to make a point of it. "Friendly," he said. "We've met plenty who weren't, but I'm hoping you are." The man regarded him closely. He was older than Dan, older than Steve, too. He carried himself well and had the look of a professional man at one point, before he grew his hair and beard long and wild. He kept the gun where it was. "What about your friend in the car?" he asked. "She means no harm either. We've taken to traveling in pairs because there has been some trouble." "You experienced any?" he asked. "We've had our share," he said carefully. "We," thought Dan. "How many is we?" he asked, hopeful. "Not sure I should say just yet. No offense," the man replied. "There are about 70 of us, mostly farming and growing crops. Only the explorers like me go around dressed like this," Dan said with a smile, hoping to reassure the man that he wasn't from a military camp. 70? He asked, straightening slightly. That's good going. He seemed to consider his situation for a little longer, then relaxed a bit and allowed the gun to rest on its sling, which he put over a shoulder. Name's Gregory, he said. You? Dan, he said, pointing his thumb at himself before turning over to his left side. Lexi's in the car with my dog. Truce? Gregory suggested. We mean no harm, I swear it, Dan replied. Gregory walked from the building and came out, still keeping clear of this armed and armored man who had walked into his world. Shall we talk? Asked Dan. Not here. Follow me, replied Gregory, climbing into his car. Neighbors. They followed Gregory away from the main road onto a playing field. It was overgrown, but well trodden in places where Gregory had driven before. He turned his car around to face them and stopped. Gregory emerged slowly, the rifle held low in one hand. Dan unclipped the carbine and left it on his seat, and he walked towards the man carrying only his suppressed Walther and the brute of a shotgun on his back. Lexi emerged, similarly disarmed, but with a sidearm visible in the holster on her chest. Dan brought one extra item with him, his flask of coffee, which he raised to Gregory as they neared. He nodded. I've got biscuits, he said without a hint of humor. After a bit of standoffish acceptance, they finally relaxed in each other's company sufficiently to talk. I found some folks about a week after. I loaded up all my stuff to go and find out what was happening, but realized it was everywhere and I wouldn't know where to start. They already live a bit like this, you know, all environmental in that, he explained. I don't stay there all the time when the weather's good. I drive around looking for people and things. Dan reciprocated with their own story, leaving out some details such as raiding other camps and killing everyone, or having their own home attacked and killing all of them too. He worried it might give the wrong impression of them. The words "I can explain" never really help, he thought. We managed to get holed up well before winter, and now we have a farm and a commercial garden with greenhouses. Dan went on to say about their solar power and hot water, which made Gregory's eyes open wider. Will you take us to your group? Lexi asked. Gregory swallowed his drink as he thought. Follow me. It'll take about 20 minutes. They all talked as they drove, running through options. Could they recruit these survivors to come back with them? Would they want to? How did they generate power? Fresh water? They followed Gregory down a farm track and saw curious-looking buildings. There were signs by the entrance making bold statements about geothermal heating and emission-free homes. They had found some kind of hippie camp, Dan thought, and he tried to practice his non-judgmental face. He would be fine as long as they didn't try to get him to meditate with them or give him an Earth name or something else ridiculous. As it was, their minds were blown by the peace of the place. They were well situated in a valley with low, rolling hills either side. They had a well and were in the process of building a timber-framed house with straw walls. They explained how they would put timber boards over the frame and pack the whole thing with mud and other things to make it weathertight. Everyone seemed happy and smiled at them as they walked around, feeling totally alien with their black clothes and guns. It was like these people had come from a different world, and not the same violent dystopia that his own group had escaped. They had a small working farm, complete with another well, and when Dan talked about the breeding problems on their own farm, someone mentioned that they had a bull and 2 cockerels, which had to be permanently separated to stop them from killing each other. As they toured the place, the word commune sprang to Dan's head. He had thoughts emerging that they could trade with these people if they had things that each other wanted. They were invited into the main building, which was formerly the visitor center, where a person could pay just under £5 for a homemade tea bag made up of wild berries and other spices, or over £6 for a small bottle of pear and elderflower cider. They probably both tasted like toilet water, Dan decided, vowing to stick to coffee and scotch. They sat, and the apparent leader of the group sat down to speak with them. She was a thin, old woman, permanently smiling in a serene manner. Dan would have probably found her very annoying a year ago, but then he wouldn't have been sitting here dressed as he was a year ago. They were offered refreshments, and both Lexi and Dan chose water. "My name is Scarlet," she said, and they introduced themselves to her in turn. She didn't look like a Scarlet. She was at least 60 and had white hair which hung thinly to her shoulders. "As you've seen, we have been blessed here," she said. It turned out that most of the people here had come in the first week. They were either workers or regular visitors to the site, and they all agreed that their little corner of peace was the best place to rebuild. "We have saved over 40 people from the harshness of the outside," she said mystically, "and we are nearly all of us happy here." Interesting, he thought. "Nearly?" he asked. "Some of those brought here do not like our way of life. They long for the things they have lost, you see," she explained. The slow way she spoke was starting to get on his nerves. "We have 2 of the younger ones who express a wish to leave, but they have not because it is not safe," she finished. "What about Gregory? Why don't they go with him?" Lexi asked. "Gregory is happy in his own company and will not take them with him. He visits occasionally, bringing those he finds in need of help, but his wish is to live alone." In the current company, Dan thought he could understand why. He got to the point. "The way I see it, we can be of use to each other. We can swap the stud animals for the farm to ensure the breeds live on. We grow our own vegetables, and we'll be adding salads to the list as soon as the weather gets better. I am offering to establish trade," he said. Scarlet smiled sickeningly. "I think that is wise. Will you return here 1 week from today? If you speak to Zachary, I'm sure he can help." Dan thanked her and stood to leave. "If you don't mind, I have another request," Scarlet said. "Go on," he replied. "The younger ones we have, who do not like it here. They do not share our philosophies and our beliefs. Will you speak with them? Explain the dangers of the outside world?" Dan said he would, but he had his own suggestion. "And if they still want to see the world, what then?" "What are you suggesting?" Scarlet asked, the curtain of tranquility over her face twitching to betray her thoughts. "If they want to go, they can come with us. If they want to come back, we will bring them back when we return. You have my word," he said firmly. Scarlet smiled again, glad that she had maneuvered this man to where she wanted him. In truth, she couldn't stand those kids. They were loud and they didn't respect nature. They wanted to eat the cows and the chickens instead of nurturing them for their eggs and milk. "Very well," she said magnanimously. They went outside to find Zachary. He was every bit the vegetarian organic farmer Dan expected, and he doubted that anything the man wore had ever had a label in. They discussed livestock, Dan's knowledge being just about sufficient to do the trade, and he agreed to bring back the bull and cockerel for straight swaps, as well as a few of last year's lambs to swap for one of their own yearling rams. They should allow the livestock population to enlarge a bit quicker, he thought, then went to find the ones who didn't fit in. Vegetarian prison. Henry was maybe a little older than Leah, and very easily bored. He had even taken to doing press-ups obsessively in an attempt to impress the older girls from the group. There were 2 of them, and he took their giggling to mean that he was getting somewhere, when in fact they were laughing at him. Lucy was 10, and looked as though she had just given up. She looked at the chicken pen for hours, longing for the chance to cook one of the ungainly birds and eat every last scrap of flesh from its bones. It consumed her. She dreamed of roast chicken. Neither enjoyed it here, and both had a similar story in that they were found and brought here, one by Gregory and one by a kind woman who harbored thoughts of raising her for future breeding. They both rebelled, Both were punished by being sent to sit in solitary boredom for hours at a time. Neither of them wanted to work, and neither wanted to stay. "Have you tried to leave?" Dan asked them. Henry did once, but he came back. He wouldn't admit that he was scared, and Dan doubted if he'd ever got to the main road. Lucy hadn't. She just sat bored. They were both unhappy. Lexi began to tell them about their home. As she spoke, the kids looked up. They grew more attentive with each line she spoke, and when finally they were offered to come and live with them instead, both jumped up to say yes. They would both have probably asked anyway. Dan couldn't believe how trusting these people were, or maybe he underestimated just how much they didn't like people who didn't fit in. He recognized it for what it was. It was one bizarre meeting about the power of Mother Nature away from being a cult. Dan had no great wish to involve the spiritual in their lives. A person's beliefs were their own, he thought. He very much believed in the concept of each to their own, but having to live under the stifling blanket of a faith you didn't want would be too much to cope with. Both kids packed their small amount of belongings and barely held their excitement as they bounced to the discovery. Dan turned to Scarlett, seeing her flanked by younger women dressed in the same way as her. "We will be back to trade in a week. If the kids don't like it there, they will be brought back then." Scarlett nodded sagely. He noticed that not one person said goodbye to the children. He turned and unlocked the Land Rover, asking them to wait. "Ash, over," he said, making the reluctant dog jump into the boot. Lucy made a noise at seeing him, and Dan explained to them both. "He is not a pet. Please don't put your hands through to him or he might bite you." He struggled for the words to get it through to them exactly what Ash was. Lexi stepped in. "Did either of you ever see a police dog?" she asked. Both nodded. "Well, until Ash knows you and gets used to you. Just be careful of him, okay? Don't try and stroke him." They understood. Henry's face when he saw their guns was a picture. His eyes grew so wide on seeing the shotgun that he could barely speak or break his gaze away. Dan talked as he drove. "There are a few of us who make sure that everyone is safe. We're the ones who go out and make the dangerous places less dangerous. It's not for everyone, but it needs to be done so we can live in safety. We're called Rangers." Henry showed his immaturity by asking outright if he could be one too. "It's about what training we've had," Dan said, thinking that he had to come up with an excuse for a girl younger than him having weapons. "We all have previous experience, which takes years to learn. You'll have to see how it goes, get really fit, and try when you're older. If you want to stay, that is." Henry sat back in his seat. Lucy said nothing for about 30 miles until she asked, "What's for lunch?" They had left the Haven, as they had called it, before mealtime, and Dan looked to Lexi. She dug into her E&E bag and came out with snack bars, crisps, and 2 bottles of water. "Here," she said, handing them back and ignoring Ash's best I'm a good boy face with his top lip tucked behind a row of teeth. "We usually eat lunch on the go as we work. There'll be a hot meal tonight, though." Neither kids really heard her. They were ripping into the carbohydrate-rich food like they had spent years in a Turkish prison, their faces melting with the satisfaction of the taste of food they weren't allowed. A few questions came from the back as they drove, and the 4 spoke about the way life went in their own personal manor house. Ash watched Lexi for a while, still waiting for his treat. He gave up, grumbled, and turned to look out of the rear window. Gains and losses. They arrived back before Steve and Joe, sedately coming down the drive and rolling over the patches on the tarmac where the blood and fluids from the wrecked cars were starting to wash away. Both made the right noises as the ornate building came into sight, although Dan felt that its original grandeur was slightly marred by the solar panels, which looked like they had landed from space on the roof. Dan pulled up to his usual space by the front door and climbed out. "Hang on here for a minute with them," he said to Lexi. She nodded. Dan let Ash out of the boot and nearly tripped over him as he made straight for the nearest tire to irrigate it. Leah met him at the door. She was wearing a belt holster with an identical gun to Dan's new Walter, which was sitting proudly on her skinny left hip in a cross-draw position. He smiled at her and asked for Marie and Kate to come and meet the newbies. Leah tiptoed and strained her eyes past him, but couldn't see inside the Discovery's tinted windows. Kate was the first out, asking Dan who he had found. "Hang on for a minute. I'll explain in one go. Is Lizzie free to give them a tour while we talk?" She nodded and went inside, bringing Alice and Lizzie out for induction duties. Marie appeared, having politely cut short one of her sessions with a survivor from the shipping container cage. Rich stayed in ops. He didn't like the stares his scars got from people who didn't know him. Dan beckoned Lexi to bring them out, and a smiling but nervous 10-year-old Lucy and 14-year-old Henry were introduced. Henry's eyes rested on Leah's left hip, but a respectable attempt at a death stare from her made him look away, embarrassed. Dan reminded himself to explain to Henry that Leah wasn't on the menu, not unless he wanted an injury or three. Lizzie and Alice took them in for the tour and for new clothes, as they were still in the white linen outfits of the organic fanatics, as Lexi had named them. As they went inside, out of sight, Dan leaned back against his vehicle and lit a smoke. Lexi and Marie did the same, and he wondered that it was strange how the idea to light a cigarette was socially catching. Rich walked out to hear the debrief and stood behind Leah. Dan explained about meeting the slightly weird loner guy and how he led them to the Haven. The way he explained the place actually made it sound really good, so he shot their collective hopes down by making a point of it seeming like a cult. "Lexi calls them the organic fanatics," he said. Lexi shrugged. "It's accurate," she added. "Anyway, it seems to us that they have no interest in having these kids back. So unless they have a big change of heart, they're ours now." Nobody disagreed with Dan's statement. Marie went back inside to make plans for the children to be inducted properly and found living space. Not only that, they needed a chaperone as such to start with. Kate followed, readying for another 2 medical histories to be taken. Dan saw Lexi look at her watch. He knew Paul would be in the gym now, and he was feeling generous. "I'll go speak to Chris about the trade. Take the afternoon off," he said. She lit up and walked inside to secure her kit, thanking him. Dan called her back to take his carbine and shotgun. He walked up to the farm with Ash sniffing along the hedgerows beside him. He found Chris talking with Melissa and gave them both the rundown on the hippie farm. Chris was annoyed. "How could I have forgotten that place?" he cursed himself. He went on to say how they used pre-machinery farming methods and described the place as the closest the area had to an Amish community. They thought the gene pool swap was a great idea, and Chris asked to accompany him on the return trip. "Of course you can," Dan agreed. "You think I'm taking a bull anywhere without your help?" Plans were made, and Melissa turned to Chris to give him her new ideas for expansion. The timing of it would allow them to get lambs out of this coming season. He bid his farewells, leaving the farm manager and chief geneticist to their discussions, and walked back to the house as he smoked. The realization of a penny legacy put a smile on his face, as he had unwittingly given his friends grand titles. He got back and was immediately collared by Leah to come and see what they had done. The large map covering one wall had been moved, as they had been sorting out the office now it wasn't partly an ammo store. In doing so, they had uncovered a large blackboard, which must have become defunct when the prison had years ago turned to computers to manage their roll call. It had a grid system for writing in numbers of prisoners based on where they were. There was a section for the farms, the gardens, the works party, the kitchens, and others. Leah and Rich had scrubbed off some sections and added new ones using Tipex. The total count section at the bottom right became their first official population counter. "Now when someone goes out," said Leah excitedly, We mark down how many go to what place and mark them back in." She made a point of rubbing R1 and R2 off of the section ranging and adding 2 to the count in the house. He looked at her. Seeing a young girl so pleased with herself for doing something new made his heart melt a little. He really was pleased with her and proud of her work. His eyes rested on the Walther on her hip, and he was about to say something about her using a weapon she hadn't been trained with. He decided not to. This girl had done everything and more to get his approval, and to be the best she could be at everything she did. She had killed to protect her home, and he thought that he should probably give her some leeway. It was way past the point where he didn't trust her with weapons, so he let it slide. "Good work. I'm impressed," he said. "You too sure you can keep on top of this, then? Lots of people moving in and out nowadays." "We've got it under control, boss," said Rich, giving a conspiratorial wink behind Leah's back. Dan turned to her. "I see you switched to the P99 too," he said. She placed her left hand on the weapon, slightly self-consciously. "Yeah, I like the weight of it. It feels chunky," she said quietly, not wishing to sound childish by admitting that she wanted to carry the same gun as him. "Me too," he said, satisfied with the flattery of imitation. He walked to the dining room to get a hot coffee. The kids were excited about the place, not giving any indication that they thought it was a temporary arrangement. He was happy with that. Word went around those in the house quickly about the new arrivals, and he found a small huddle around them. He saw Lucy tucking into a plate of jam tarts brought out by Kara, who was ever happy to see people enjoying her treats. Henry was telling them about the place where they had been, and he wasn't making it sound very welcoming. Dan noticed Eve listening intently, lapping up every word he said. He hadn't thought of her for a while. Her or the child who spent months attached to her leg. He couldn't see the girl now, and looked around for her. He leaned closer to Nina as she walked past carrying drinks for the kids, and asked her where she was. "She moved into Kara's room now," she said, shocked that Dan didn't know. "Both the little ones stay with her, but the girl still doesn't talk to anyone." He felt a little bit bad for not knowing, but then reasoned with himself that he wasn't exactly idle and couldn't be expected to know the social ins and outs of over 70 people. He left them to it and went to find something constructive to do. Carrying his coffee and 2 jam tarts, he walked out through the lounge area where Ash had curled up on one of the large settees. Smelling food, Ash jumped down and followed expectantly, receiving the pastry crusts to reinforce his faith in scrounging from people. They walked outside where Dan lit another cigarette and stood in the cold sunlight. He suddenly felt very lonely, as if everyone else but him was busy right now. He thought of things he could do to be constructive and settled on a visit to Pete to see how he was healing. Dan found Pete sitting up in bed with Alice reading to him. He could read just fine, but he liked the company. Not wanting to intrude, Dan nodded his hellos to the pair and left. Still lost for something to do, he went to his room and took off his boots. With Ash taking up a large portion of the floor, Marie made it clear she was not sharing the bed with him too. He lay back and picked up the book he had on the table next to the bed. He'd meant to start reading it about 6 months ago, but until now he hadn't had the chance. He must have dozed off at one point, because Marie woke them both, having looked everywhere for him to say dinner was ready. As they walked downstairs, she said that Eve had come to talk to her. She beat around the bush a lot, but she wanted to go on the trade run to see the Haven. Dan saw no real reason to refuse her, so agreed. Establishing trade. The week went quickly, and on the day their first trade caravan went out, Dan met an excited Chris ready with a Land Rover and the horse box trailer. He towed the bull with a lividly aggressive chicken sitting in a cage on the back seat. Anna was driving a pickup, not dissimilar to the Thunderbird 2, only hers had a tin cover on and half a dozen sheep in the back instead of a huge machine gun. Dan left Ash with Leah, which caused him more worry than giving her guns did. He was satisfied that they would be fine, as Ash would just spend the day in ops waiting for her to feed him. They wove their way through the towns and villages until Dan recognized a familiar vehicle sitting on an approach to the road. He pointed it out to Eve, who had remained annoyingly silent the whole journey. As he slowed down near Gregory's car, allowing him to pull out and lead the way, Eve sat up. "I've seen that car before," she said. Dan looked at her. "Just before you turned up, that was the car I saw the soldier in." Dan thought for a minute. If she had stepped out and spoken to Gregory instead of hiding, then she and the girl would have probably been brought here months ago and saved him from hearing her whine. They pulled up after bouncing along the track, and Eve's eyes lit up. She got out of the car and walked slowly, as if in a daze. Dan got out and waved the others through to the farm area, hoping to get done quickly. Zachary shook hands with Chris, and maybe Dan imagined it, flinched from the strength of his grip. They spoke briefly, then organized the loading and unloading of animals. Dan walked to the visitor center, or whatever they called it now, to find Eve sitting with Scarlet and her two flanking clones. They were drinking some kind of herbal infusion, which boring people like him would probably call tea. He had never seen Eve smile, and she was smiling now. He was invited to sit down, and a cup of infused something or other was poured for him. He tried it, and found it to taste like shit. He politely swallowed and put the cup down, resisting the urge to spit it out. "Well, ask him, child," urged Scarlet with a false smile of serenity. Eve straightened herself in her carved wooden seat, then looked at him. "I want to stay," she said with a grand amount of drama. "Okay," he said, and then turned to Scarlet. "They're swapping animals now. Shall we make this a yearly thing to keep our herds healthy?" Scarlet seemed taken back that he hadn't made more of an issue about Eve's big news. "Yes, that seems like a wonderful idea," she said, recovering her poise. Eve tried again to get a reaction. "I won't need any of my things. Everything I could want will be provided here," she said. "Except shampoo, conditioner, razors, toothpaste," thought Dan. "That's fine," he said, not bothering to be as false as the hippies and make up rubbish about how she would be missed and blah, blah, blah. Truth was, she constantly moaned, wouldn't lift a finger to help, and instead of looking after the traumatized girl who clung to her, she tried to dump her off on anyone else. She had finally succeeded, and if she wanted to go and live in a teepee or whatever and dance in the mud with no shoes on, then that was fine by him. Dan got up to leave. "Thanks again for your hospitality," he said to Scarlet, receiving an annoying slow nod like she was the oracle of all things. If he didn't like her much before, then he certainly wasn't under her spell now. He walked to the door and said over his shoulder, "In case you were wondering, the kids wanted to stay with us." He left without waiting for an answer. He found Chris had loaded the bull without issue, but the cockerel he had in exchange was even more foul-tempered than the one they had brought. It was a similar story with the young ram. Its little horns had just started to grow and looked out of place, like a teenage boy with a light fluff of a mustache. He displayed a bit of attitude to Anna until Chris picked it up bodily and slid it into the back of the pickup. "Good to go?" Chris said to Dan with a satisfied smile. "Me too," Dan replied, smiling wider. "I've done my own trade." They looked puzzled until he couldn't contain it any longer. "I've swapped Eve for the kids." They were still confused, and he explained that Eve had made a huge drama about announcing that she wanted to stay and be at one with nature. They both laughed with him and began the journey home. So was established Dan's settlement's first official trade route. Fish out of water. Emma gave up on the idea of using a vehicle after a week. She eventually found a working car on the third day of her journey, living off the remaining food and water she found in abandoned shops still hosting the desiccated remains of the former owners. The problem was the roads. They were blocked in most places. She hadn't driven in nearly 7 years since she had first learned, having lived in university accommodation and used public transport ever since. She didn't know the city from the road perspective, and using trains was clearly no longer an option. In the end, she had to travel over 30 miles to the south to escape the built-up areas before she began to look for transport again. She traveled lightly, with only the small rucksack containing a few items. She kept the handgun and spare things of bullets, magazines she believed they were called, and kept the precious laptop safe. 3 times she had to hide when she heard the sounds of other people. She couldn't afford the delay or the inherent risk of interacting with them. She had taken to traveling on foot during darkness, a darkness so complete as she had never seen before. The lack of light pollution made her see the skies over the city as she never had. Eventually, she found a working vehicle, having used the hill it was parked on to get the engine going. She began her long, looping journey around the country to find her way north. She had never driven on a motorway before, and found that she had to go slowly and weave between abandoned and crashed cars, their drivers' skeletal remains left where they were exposed. After she had escaped the city limits, she took to traveling during the daylight, twice in the first day having to go back up the motorway to find an alternative route as the pile-ups had blocked the lanes entirely. She made slow progress, made worse on the 4th day of driving when she struggled to siphon enough fuel to keep going. She tried the radio as she drove, finding nothing but static on every station. Not even an emergency broadcast remained, and she wondered if the system had ever even been activated. She crept northwards, sticking to the center of the country and using the blue road signs to direct her. New life, old life. On Dan's instruction, the rangers had been hunting in pairs further afield. The farms were a hive of activity, with crops being planted and animals being bred. Chris was happy and excited, claiming that the herds would be doubled within a couple of years. There was fresh meat, and fresh vegetables were starting to ripen. Apple and plum trees were sprouting, and every square inch of greenhouse space at the gardens was either already planted or earmarked for planting soon. Dan was sleeping off a night shift spent awake in ops when he woke around lunchtime to noise downstairs. More than normal noise. There was some excitement going on. He dressed in trousers and boots with a t-shirt, fitting a gun behind his back as habitually as lacing his boots. He made his lazy way into the dining room, thinking caffeine thoughts. A woman and 2 men were sitting at the tables, surrounded by those not out at work. 3 new pairs of hands were a good thing, Dan thought as he poured a coffee. He turned and rested against the long table as he sipped. Heads moved in the small crowd, and he saw the profile of one of the men. A flash of recognition hit Dan, making him feel sick to his stomach. He knew this man from his distant past. He put down his coffee cup without taking his eyes away and reassured himself that the gun was just behind his right hip before he drew himself up to his full height. "Kelvin Parks," Dan announced in an icy tone that cut through the noise like a razor. The room was instantly silenced. One of the inexplicable customs of their new world was that nobody ever used a surname. The man went pale and turned towards him. "Me? That's not my name," he said, adding a disarming smile. The reply gave Dan all the confirmation he needed. That wheedling voice, the slight lisp, the utterly obsequious tone. It was him, and he absolutely had to go. "Stand up," Dan commanded. Others started to speak, to question what he was doing. Some of them had heard that tone of voice before. Andrew watched in confused fear. The last time he'd heard Dan speak like this, he had nearly killed a man in a supermarket with his bare hands. The man didn't move. He looked around, smiling at the other faces in the room in silent appeal for help. Dan took a step forward and drew himself up. Stand up. Now, he said, fighting to contain his rising anger. What are you doing? Marie hissed at him. He didn't take his eyes off the man and replied, I'll tell you in a minute. He stepped forward, now within reach of the sitting man. Get up, he growled. The man stood, panic evident on his face, and started to speak. Dan's temper finally snapped. He grabbed the man by his jacket and dragged him from the room on his tiptoes, prompting shouts and screams from others. As Dan dragged the man out of the room, he threw himself on the floor, holding up his hands to fend off Dan's aggression. Dan dragged him to his feet again, locking his arm behind his back with his left and using his right hand to pull the opposite shoulder. The man moved in pain, arching his back to try and relieve the agonizing pressure on his right arm and shoulder. He pleaded with Dan as he was marched into ops. Rich looked up in surprise as the disruption burst into his piece. Dan threw the man into the room, making him stagger to remain standing. Rich, search him, and don't let him out of your sight, Dan said, snarling. Rich did as he was asked. Dan turned to see Marie standing in front of him, furious, and a small crowd gathering behind her. What the hell? She began, lost for words at his sudden violence. Dan had no choice but to admit what he knew, exposing his own history in doing so. Because he's a fucking sex offender, he said loudly, silencing them all. I know this. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The mixture of shock and disgust at the revelation left them stunned. He will not stay here. I will not allow it, he finished. He saw Kara at the back of the crowd, ushering the growing gaggle of children away into the house. You're sure? Marie asked quietly. Positive. Hand on Bible, he replied. She knew what that meant. She thought for a moment before asking Rich to watch the man. She nodded her head back inside to indicate that Dan should follow. She walked towards the dining room, sending runners to collect the other council members. A tense wait ensued while the others were gathered, and Marie sent everyone else from the room. When they were gathered, Dan asked for a rundown of how the three came to be there. Lexi and Joe found them traveling south, told them about this place and brought them here. As we have before, she added, warning Dan not to lay blame. Where were they coming from? He asked. Nobody knew. He suggested bringing the other man in. He was called Rob. He and the woman had been traveling south to escape the next harsh winter. They found the other man alone, coming from the northeast. What story did he give you? Marie asked. Not much, really, said Rob. He said he'd spent a few years up there working, but had no family around. He asked to come with us. Rob was thanked and invited to leave. You all have my word that this man is a dangerous, predatory pedophile, Dan said. Nobody answered. How do you know, mate? Asked Neil quietly. Dan sagged. 12 years ago, I worked not far from here. I was a police officer. A young girl went missing, and by the time we got into her laptop at home, it was too late. He pretended to be her age and arranged to meet her. She got in his car and he took her and repeatedly raped her. We threw everything we had at it and found his car on CCTV picking her up. I found him and locked him up. He still had her blood on his trousers, he said, swallowing hard at the images flashing in his mind. She killed herself just after the trial, he said flatly. Tablets. Marie broke the silence. Does anyone here doubt Dan? Nobody did. So what do we do with him? She asked. Kara, for once, found her voice. He's not coming anywhere near my kids, she said. A murmur of agreement rippled around. All in favor of banishing him immediately, Dan said, rising. All hands were raised. Dan strode from the room back to ops. He threw on his equipment and transferred the Walther to his vest, screwing on the short suppressor. "Rich, with me," he said. Rich put on his own equipment vest, watching the cowering man at all times.
"Please,"
he begged.
"you've got this all wrong. I'm not a pedophile."
"Shut your fucking mouth," snapped Dan. "I know exactly what you are. I caught you. Remember?" A slow veil of recognition washed over his face, quickly hidden behind more denials. He wasted his breath. "Your name is Kelvin Parks. You are a convicted sex offender who should be serving a life sentence." The man opened his mouth but couldn't speak. Dan forced him to empty his pockets, finding an almost empty wallet. It contained a debit card in the name of Mr. K.L. Parks. Dan smiled triumphantly, holding the card out as further proof to the others. "Rich, empty their car and follow us," Dan said, grabbing a roll of black duct tape and wrapping it around Kelvin's wrists roughly as he twisted them into the small of his back.
"Stop! Please!"
whined Parks pointlessly. He was thrown in the boot of the Discovery, watched carefully by Ash from the back seat. Rich threw the handful of bags out of the car as Rob picked up his own.
"That's it,"
Rob said, pointing at a bag. Rich put it back in the car and drove after Dan. They drove for nearly 2 hours, at times with Rich struggling to keep up. Eventually, Dan pulled up at a quarry on waste ground and got out. He dragged Parks from the boot and dropped him heavily onto the ground. Parks was crying. Dan pointed to Rich where he wanted the car. He dragged the man to his feet and slammed him against the side of his Discovery. "Where are we?" Dan asked him. Parks moaned and closed his eyes tightly. "Tell me where we are!" Dan screamed in his face. He drew the knife from his shoulder, seeing eyes widen in front of him. He spun Parks around and slashed through the bindings, cutting him in the process. Dan turned him again and hit him hard in the stomach. As Kelvin Parks gasped for breath in the dirt, Dan walked to Rich. "This is where he took an 11-year-old girl," he said. "He made friends with her through the internet. He groomed her for months, pretending he was her age. They agreed to meet up, and he brought her here." He walked over and stood above him. "Tell my friend what you did to her," he said quietly.
"Please." "No," Parks begged. "Tell him. Now," Dan said again. "She loves me,"
he sobbed pitifully.
"They made her say those things about me."
"She was a child. You lied to her and then you raped her. She killed herself because of you." Dan looked at Rich, seeing silent agreement in his face. He drew his gun, pointing it at the man's head. "Get up," he said. "Get up and get in the car. We're letting you go." Parks stopped crying, barely able to believe what he had heard. Nervously, he got to his feet and walked towards the car with the engine running, never taking his eyes off the gun. Dan twitched the barrel at him, indicating that he should climb into the driver's seat. As Parks got behind the wheel, Dan glanced once at Rich. Rich nodded. Dan stepped round and fired once into Parks's right hand, the bullet destroying bone, tendon, and ligament as it tore through his flesh. He screamed in agony and shock. Rich ran to the passenger door and shoved the car in gear as Dan forced the man's legs onto the pedals. The car went into gear, and the engine howled as it revved highly. They shut the doors, cocooning the screaming man inside the car. Dan leaned the gun into the window and shot him again in his left leg, making Parks flinch his foot off the clutch. The car leapt forward, hopping as it went. The momentum of the slope took the car in its inevitable grip, and slowly it rolled to the cliff edge, where it tipped to crash end over end into the dirty water below. "Technically," said Rich as casually as he could as they both looked at the sinking car below them, "I saw him drive off on his own." "You?" "Yup," said Dan as he lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Rode off into the sunset all by himself. I doubt he'll be back." They climbed back in the car, Rich to return to his peaceful day, and Dan to go and avoid explaining why he hid his past from everyone. Recovery. Pete's shoulder was healing slowly, helped, he claimed, by the two little spaniels who lay on his legs and seemed happy to sleep all day and all night, with occasional breaks to eat or go outside. Every day James went to him for instructions in the morning, and every evening he would sit with the old poacher and discuss his results, receiving tips and pointers based on his performance. James was putting weight on, and no longer resembled the skinny, terrified kid Lexi had brought home. He had grown a sturdy set of shoulders, having taken over every heavy task from Pete. He trusted the older man, which was why one evening Pete told him straight that Pip didn't need him to follow her everywhere and that she was going to be fine without his help. What Dan learned later was that the young girl had spent a long time talking with Pete, as they were the only ones being treated daily by the medical team. She had asked Pete for advice, then for his help in putting James off trying to be the husband he had never been asked to be. James seemed to take it well, but a subtle eye was kept on him to be sure. Jack stepped in a few times a week to show him some skills and teach him about different types of animals and when their breeding seasons were. Pete was even allowed out for a few hours at a time, which he spent fishing while sitting on a folding chair on the lake's jetty. True, he did have a fishing rod, but the only thing he ever caught seemed to be a small bottle of scotch. Dan didn't feel guilty about the ruse. He had discussed it with Kate beforehand, who agreed, as she didn't want him sitting in medical either moping or drinking. "It's actually not that much," she said to Dan as they discussed Pete's drinking in private one day. "He never seems to be actually drunk as such. He just needs a top-up to keep him going. I've seen way worse alcohol problems than this, and I would class Pete as functioning at absolute worst." Dan had to agree. Not once had he ever seen Pete staggering drunk, not even at Christmas when he himself had ended up throwing up in the snow, and Pete never showed any adverse signs of the alcohol affecting him. He decided to categorize Pete as drinker now, and not alcoholic. Marie had started to take her one day off a week to coincide with Dan's. They enjoyed a lazy lie-in, which they planned ahead for, and stocked his room with drinks and snacks the night before. After a morning not wasted in bed, they got up for lunch and did whatever they felt like for the rest of the day. Marie called it pottering. The routine had established itself well enough that on those days, Ash would spend the morning with Leah. He knew she loved the status of walking around with the huge dog at her heel. Maybe Ash would father a litter one day, and she could have her own, Dan thought. On one of their free days, Marie was restless. She wanted to go out somewhere. The irony of being a ranger for fun on his day off from being a ranger wasn't lost on him, but if she wanted to go out, then he would take her out. "Where would Madam like to go?" he asked lazily. "Anywhere," she replied. "Just take me out somewhere." He realized the furthest she had been from the house since he brought her back months ago was to the gardens where she visited Cedric and Maggie every week. "Okay," he said, "but you work to my rules." He kissed her arm as they lay in bed. She rolled over slightly so he could see her raised eyebrows. "Oh?" she asked. "You move when I say, and you stand still when I say." He kissed her shoulder. "And you follow my instructions to the letter." He kissed her cheek, making her squeak and pull away. "You're so melodramatic," she teased. They dressed, and Leah reluctantly relinquished control of his dog back to him. Ash seemed unhappy too, as he probably doubted Dan would feed him anywhere near as much as Leah would. He drove well, showing off and completely wasting his effort, as Marie didn't even notice. She was no longer the only person there who knew what Dan had been before, but she decided to push a little harder for the reasons why he was so moody at times. She asked him to stop the car. She got out and looked around, spinning a slow circle. Dan scanned the area with his weapon, looking for dangers. He was just about to call her back to the car to tell her to be careful, when he realized that all he ever saw nowadays was danger. He never stopped to see what she was seeing. Now that the earth had started to claim back all the concrete and tarmac, and the busy pace of the world had replaced the rat race with the race for survival, he never stopped to appreciate the beauty around him. It was a clear day, and from the motorway flyover they had stopped on, he could see for miles. He could see 3 sets of hills, the 2 smaller ones showing the way north through a valley and a much larger range to the south. He had driven through this place so many times in his life, but never once had he seen what was beyond the line of traffic. He lowered his carbine and slowly stood up straight. "Relax, Daniel," she said kindly. Unburdened. He relaxed. He walked over to her, discarding the weapon by slinging it behind his back, and put his arms around her waist. He kissed her gently, and she responded. They disentangled themselves and leaned back against the barrier. They lit cigarettes, and as he exhaled slowly, she asked him the question he'd known was coming. "What happened?" she said quietly. From all their conversations, all his attempts at diverting or distracting her, it always came back to this. She wanted to know what tortured him so much. 3 years ago, nearly, he started. I was a firearms officer. You know, flash car and sexy-looking kid. I was happy with life. She was in the job, too. And the kids. He stopped, swallowing down the tears which threatened. It was a Friday night, busy as usual. We got a call for a kid with a knife on the outskirts. Bad area, you know. Concrete jungle kind of place. All high-rises, high crime rates, and high unemployment. Marie knew. We got there, looked around, and couldn't see anyone who looked more suspicious than normal. We'd had a lot of hoax calls there. Kids on the estate throwing things at the cars. A couple of guys got hurt. One was quite bad when a freezer went over the balcony and hit a car. It was becoming an estate you didn't go onto unless you went in force. Marie knew those areas well, having sent plenty of people in force to fetch her the bad people to lock away. Anyway, walking back to the car and my mate goes down. They'd lobbed a half-brick at us from a balcony. Just dumb luck that he took it in the head. Lights out, fractured skull. He drew on his cigarette, taking it down to the end before he flicked it away with his thumb and forefinger. A kid appears from by the car. It came to my head that they'd figured out what we were and were going to take the guns. I still believe that now, even when it doesn't matter anymore. I tried to call for backup, but this kid ran at us. He had something in his hand. I couldn't see it clearly, but I was sure it was a weapon. I drew on him, shouting at the top of my voice for him to stop. He didn't, so I shot him once in the chest, he said, eyes vacant and tapping the fingers of his right hand on his sternum. Marie stayed silent, letting Dan fill the gap. They all scattered, he said, looking up with tears streaming down his face. Backup arrived and helped me do CPR on the kid. My mate survived. The kid died unseen. They took my gun, swabbed my hands, and led me away to give my initial statement. They all had that look of pity on their faces. Dead men walking. He cuffed at his eyes. The press screamed racism, police brutality, black youth murdered by white cop, all that shit. He was 14 years old. I was sure it was a gun he was carrying, but the only thing they found was his fucking phone. He was running to help, and I killed him. He wanted to be a paramedic when he grew up. He was first aid mad when all the other kids his age were chalking up robberies and weapons charges. He cried. It was awful. They hung me out to dry. My name got leaked, and I had death threats. Racist pig murderer. That's what they painted on my car. I went downhill badly. Depression, insomnia, mood swings. I was in a bad way. Not just my career. I didn't care about that anymore. But my life was over. He looked down at the floor. That's when she left and took the kids. I found out afterwards that she'd been dropping on her back for her boss anyway. Not that it mattered by then. Everything I'd ever worked for was gone. I did my job, and the organization crucified me for it. I was in a situation and reacted how I was taught, but it was wrong. I was wrong. Not once did the job stand up in the inquest and say I was innocent. They bent over backwards to help prove I wasn't. After 18 months of hell, the inquiry declared a lack of any evidence to convict me for murder, but nobody forgot. It was ruled an accidental death following police contact. I'd moved back to where I'd started out before transferring. Everywhere I went, it was the whispering. Ask the bloke who shot that kid. Bastards. You'd think your own side would look after you, wouldn't you? After that, word of the private prosecution came through. I was suspended again and was looking at a trial for manslaughter. He paused. It looked likely that I was going down for it. Dan angrily wiped the tears from his face and lit another cigarette. So now you know everything, he said bitterly. Still want me around? Marie had stayed still and silent as it all poured out of him, and now she took a breath to speak. He held up a hand and shushed her. She fought down her angry indignation and suppressed the urge to cuff him around the head. He leapt to his feet and threw away the cigarette, calling Ash back to heel as he swung the carbine back to his front and raised it in one smooth action. He squinted through the optic pointed down the abandoned and overgrown motorway. "What is it?" she asked, a hint of fear making her voice slightly higher than normal. "Movement," he said gruffly. "Vehicle. Almost a mile away." Hard choices. Emma nursed the uncomfortable car northwards on a motorway littered with cars and green plants overgrowing the hard shoulder and central reservation. She was sure last week that she was going to die. She had started to cough, and it felt drained very quickly. She recorded her notes throughout, dictating what she felt to be her own death, so that someone might find her research and the data she carried, and one day understand what it was that happened to them all. For 3 days she coughed and shivered, drinking all the water she carried and being too weak to find more. She was confused, fevered. She couldn't understand how she had gone past the 48-hour mark. Had she? Was she not reading her watch correctly? She was even more confused when she woke up on the 4th day feeling better. She had coughed so hard that her throat was sore and had bled from the minute rips caused by the violent coughing. Her abdomen hurt, and looking under her top she saw her stomach muscles were more pronounced than ever. She found herself looking at her six-pack and wondering who it could belong to, as it couldn't be hers. She had coughed herself to death, and this was some form of afterlife. That was it. Only it wasn't. As her mind cleared from the fever she had suffered, she realized that she had been ill but had not died. She suffered exactly the same symptoms, so she thought, but the virus had not killed her. She saw her digital voice recorder abandoned on the floor next to where she'd lain sweating and shivering. She had left it on and flattened the battery. Hopefully she could charge it in the car when she got moving again, but first, she needed water. She needed water, food, and clean clothes. She had to admit she stank. She gathered what she needed, taking aspirin to try and numb the pain in her head and body. She found clothes to wear in an abandoned shop after climbing in through the window. She washed with cold water and helped herself to deodorant and fresh clothes before leaving through a fire escape. She paused at the sign, which told her that the door was alarmed, and pushed the bar anyway. She doubted there was anyone alive close enough to hear it. She started her car and continued north, completely unaware that she was being watched. The two men in the car followed her. They kept back in the distance, keeping her car over a mile away when the geography allowed, and waiting for the right time. Dan whistled Ash and told him to get in. The dog launched himself through the open window of the Discovery. Dan started to walk sideways, keeping the car in his scope as he moved towards the driver's side. "Get in, Marie," he said calmly.
We're not going after them, are we? She asked. I think, let's call up the others.
She reached for the CB. "No time," he said, and he started the big 3-liter engine as she watched the car approach without the need for the optic. "Female. Alone," he said as he reversed and went to drive down the exit slip to get behind the car. Benefits of no traffic, he thought. He stopped, turning the nose of the car to the left and moving to lean out of the window and raise the gun again.
What is it?
Asked Marie, flustered and more than a little annoyed at him. He didn't answer, just reached for the CB. "It's Dan. Anyone there?" he said, keying the switch.
"Here, boss, go."
Leah snapped back efficiently after a few seconds. "Damn. Who's there with you?" he asked.
"Just me. Lexi and Steve are off-site, Rich is swimming in the lake, and Joe is sleeping off the night shift,"
she replied, sounding curious. Shit, he thought. He either had to do this alone and keep Marie safe or ask Leah to drive to find them. If she left now, she could be backing him up in 10 minutes. He looked at Marie, agonizing over the decision.
"Is she ready?"
she asked, reading his thoughts easily. He nodded and keyed the mic again. "Fastball up, kid. I need you to write the following down. Ready?"
A second's pause, then go.
He gave very succinct directions to his current location. Then, "One vehicle seen. Second vehicle looks to be stalking it. Suspect hostiles. I need you to back me up. Get on the motorway the wrong way and follow."
Yes. Shoot.